Hello, welcome to today's video. We're going to detour a little bit, and rather than talk about workflows, we're going to talk about Alteryx functions. Alteryx has a lot of functions that help you, and keep in mind that functions can be utilized in more than just the formula widget. It can be used in filters, it can be used in actions, it can be used in multi-row, multi-formula. There's a lot of places where functions inside of Alteryx can be used and make your workflow simpler to develop. And as with widgets, people typically just stick to the few formulas that they're comfortable with and very seldom delve outside of those functions. But it's important to see all the functions that are there and feel comfortable with experimenting and using them. And again, I always highlight the experimenting part because you need to see exactly what it's going to do rather than stick it in the middle of a workflow and hope that it does exactly what you want it to do. That being said, we're going to talk about some of the non-standard functions, assuming that you've done some of the basic ones, so that we don't have to take days and days to talk about them. As one side comment to this, I'm as guilty as you are. When I was going through the list of functions and trying to determine which ones to show you, I found some functions that I did not know existed, and I wish I had known existed months or possibly years ago, because they would have made my workflows a whole lot easier, and I'll mention those as we go through it. So thank you for having me do this video, because I increased my knowledge of Alteryx and moved it to a new step. Now, how do you get help on the individual functions? Number one way is that as you're typing in a function name, it brings up a very basic help if you hover over the function name that you're going to use as you select it. And you can go to the Alteryx website. They have a nice document that gives you an overview of each of the functions. This is the website address, and I am going to include this in comments in this video. You can also find it just by simply floating through the products and documentation that are available on the Alteryx community and drill down into finding the functions documentation. I myself like to have this as a bookmark because I do refer to it, even to the ones that I know regularly and use regularly. I will go back to this documentation to figure out exactly what some of the nuances of the functions are. This is in 3 parts. It's a little bit long and involved to talk about each of these. I might actually make this 2 parts, but for today we're going to be dealing with part 1, talk about just some of the functions, the conditional, the operator, test, min, max, and math functions. These are all categories of functions that Alteryx puts in their documentation, so I chose just to hold on to theirs. After that, we'll talk about the conversion and string functions, and then finally the really extensive list of date time functions that can help you quite a bit, as well as understanding some of the individual parameters that you can pass into these to make them even more applicable to what you might be doing. But first, I was looking at getting a data set to use in these examples so that I just didn't keep flipping between this piece of data, that piece of data. So I decided to use one of my Daisy Hill Data Mart tables. It's the Puppy Training Fact Table. It's a denormalized dimensional data mart that I built. Sorry about that. And as you can see here, when you start to build relational data, you have relations. A dimensional model is just one example of a relational database. You can also have third normal form, fourth normal form, etc. And so as you can see, we have the puppy training fact with its relations into the dimensions. And when we want to look at all the data to do analytics against puppy training, we need to bring in all of this data in order to either further research it or blend it or do some analytical pullouts. This is what we want to see. So when we look at this data set, we have to bring all of these dimensions into it. And this is where the business community tends to push back from a relational database design, saying, why do I want to join all this data together? Why can't it just be there when I want to get it? And the answer is, well, there's a very complicated answer to that one. Data architects like to have very structured data. It makes it easier to manage the data, create the data, gives you data integrity, data quality, etc., etc. If you're wondering how we go about designing one of these and why we design one of these, please subscribe to the channel and go ahead into the comments and say you would like to know more about data modeling and data structures and data stores. And I can begin a series of videos talking just about that, because I actually have a class, or actually two classes that are quite lengthy, where I've taught business analysts about data structures and data modeling. And so I'd be more than happy to begin to share that with you as well. So again, subscribe, drop me a comment if you want to know more about this. But right now what we're looking at is saying, wow, I don't want to have to go ahead and join all this data. And what does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and bring in our Alteryx. And you can see that this is the puppy training fact table. And then these are each of the dimensions. So what I have to do is bring each dimension in and join them together. And then when I get done with this at the very end, as we run through this very quickly, we have a very nice data set that has all of the attributes associated with the training fact table and all of the dimensions that are related to it. So this is where I can now begin to construct any kind of analytical information that I want from this. So when you look at this, you sort of go, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to create this every single time I query this data, because that's just frightening to have to create this every time. So the answer to that problem can take one of two steps. One is, if your data resides in a database and you have access to your database, you can build a robust semantic layer. And again, if you want to know about creating that semantic layer, drop me a note in a comment and we can talk about what it means to have a robust semantic layer for your database and how you would go about creating it. But just in case, for example, these are all Alteryx files, just to put them out there and store them. We don't have the option of using a database view for physical files that are sitting on your machine. Again, these are also my database. I could do it that way. But what I wanted to say is that once you've created this denormalized workflow, it'd be nice to share it with other people, or just possibly reuse it yourself every time you want to do some training work. You don't want to have to repeat this, cut and paste it, etc. Well, this goes back to some of my earlier classes. We can just turn this into a macro, and really the easiest macro you will ever try to build. So you basically take this workflow that generates a very nice set of data, and all you do is stick a macro output on it. If we look at data in the interface category, right here we have the macro output. I just simply stuck a macro output on the end of it, saved it as a macro in my macro folder. And so then when I want to use this data, it's very simple. I create a new workflow. And what I do is go into my macro category that I've added to my category ribbon. And if we come along here, it is make denormalized. As you can see here, make denormalized puppy training macro. I go to my favorites, drop a browse on the end of this, run this, and poof, there you go. I now have it denormalized without having to create any additional steps whatsoever. So this way I can reuse this macro every time I need to look at my puppy training, because there's a lot of marketing and personnel reports that are being generated from it, and so every workflow doesn't need to denormalize everything all on its own. I can now use this macro. So first, let me show you the documentation. I have it saved inside of Alteryx. I've called mine Alteryx Help Functions. And it brings you up this page, which is Functions. If you're wondering how to get here, go to the Alteryx homepage and click on Community. Click on Support Help Documentation. Down here we have Alteryx Designer Overview. And then within this is the General Designer Help with functions over here. And again, I've included the link in a comment down below. If you have trouble finding it, please let me know and we can get you there quicker. So what we're going to do with this workflow is just basically to start out with by showing you a simple formula and creating that simple formula, so I can talk about creating a formula in there. And then from that, we will go ahead and just sort of walk through all the functions of attributes that I've created, because it's a little bit easier just showing you once you know the general process. So what we want to do is to create a couple of formulas, actually a bunch of formulas, and so we do that by simply dragging our formula widget down off of the favorites or preparation, because it's dark blue. And now we're presented with this screen. And so what you can do here is you can modify an existing attribute through a function, or you can create a new one. And keep in mind that when these, you can have as many of these as you like listed down. You can reorder them, you can delete them. I did have a business analyst that had like 5 formulas stacked in a row because they didn't realize they could click plus here and just simply get a new one and delete with the trash can just to get rid of one. So since what we are going to be doing is creating new ones, we go into select column. We simply add a column. We want to give this one a name of attended code. And I always remind people, because I'm the one that violates this all the time because I forget to do it, and that is as soon as I create a new attribute, I like to go ahead and give it the proper data type. This keeps me from flipping forward in process and wondering where an error came from. It's simply because I did not give it a good data type. Also, recommendations for what functions to choose as you begin to type reflect what your data type is. So attended code is going to be a V string, and we're going to start out by introducing the IIF or IIF or IIF. And as you can see here, that this is the little help that pops up when we're typing this in. It shows that we want a Boolean, an X, and a Y. And a little bit as we highlight through there, you can see some more help ticks come up so that we can check there. We can click on that. It types in the shell of that. If you don't like squinting and reading it, because I don't, if you hold the control key and hit your mouse wheel, you can make it bigger or smaller so it's much easier to read. I am a big proponent of readability. Also, if you have a laptop and using a touchpad, you can spread your fingers apart and it does the same thing, or bring 2 fingers closer together and it will make it smaller. So here is the general format of what this is. I like to make things a little bit easier to read as well, so I'm going to go ahead and break this into pieces. What this says is that we'll be creating a value that is basically an if then else. So if the Boolean, which is the logical test that we want to do, is true, give it a value of X. If the comparator is false, give it the value of Y. So we want to fill in both of those. So we'll double click on here. If you haven't seen functions before, we hit the open bracket and that brings up our attributes. So we want to do attended indicator. If it equals 0, so that's the Boolean expression that says basically if the attended indicator equals 0, then the true value you want to give it is going to be did not attend, or actually the false. She has some things to talk about. So in the Boolean world, if it's equal to 0, it is true, and 0 typically means false in most of the world. That's what I've done when I've set my indicator, 0 meaning it's not true, and 1 being it is true. So sort of the attribute is backwards from that case, but that's all right. So if it is equal to 0, this puppy did not attend, otherwise they attended. We put single quotes around or double quotes around, and we can show you that as well. You can put double quotes around these to see how they work. You notice that there's a little red squiggle under there. If you can actually see that, it's because there's an error. So it will actually do some real-time testing to make sure that what you've given it is true. And then you also can look up here in the data preview. It will take the first record and look to see what that value would do within this function. So we can go ahead and execute that. You notice that the comments become very, very verbose as you go through this. We can take a look here at the end of this output. And we can see that we've created a new, if I drag this properly, we've created a new attribute, field, or column, whichever you like to call it. It is called attended code. It either says attended or did not attend, depending upon the attend indicator. Slide across here, you can see that our attend indicator is a 1 and a 0, which means they attended and then did not attend. So that is a very simple way of doing an if then else, just in case you don't like the if then else structure. I vacillate between using one or the other depending upon my mood. I tend to think of this being much more simple, but if I'm doing something for a business analyst, I usually put the if then else in there just so they have a better understanding of what I am trying to do. But it actually makes it nice, it's much more compressed. A couple of things we can do for housekeeping up here, in case you didn't notice. We can add a comment. This is a comment, and this can be on multiple lines. We start it with a slash and a asterisk. There we go. And we end it with a slash, asterisk, and another slash. So this is a comment. We can make this as many lines long as we like, and we can move this around anyhow we want, taking up as much space as we want to do. And then we also have the ability to do inline comments. If I want to put a comment on the end, I can put 2 slashes and say this is the condition. And we'll drag this to the side so that you can see the comment in all of its glory. Very stubborn it's getting right here. Let's try it again. There we go. Wow, what a day. I need to go take a break. I've been doing this too long. There we go. So there is our condition. We can go ahead and put a bunch of spaces in here, another double slash and say true. And then down here, put some more spaces and false. So we can do some commenting along the way. This does not affect the way it executes. So it still runs identically. So let's look at some more of the functions that I went ahead and decided to chose to put into this presentation. We'll click up here on my functions number 1 so we can see them and talk about them. This is one that was already there that we had done together. Now keep in mind that these get executed in order so you can do things the way you like to. We also have a second way of doing the if then else when things are more complicated. If you've seen an if then else, if then, else if, else, end structure, they can get pretty messy, as well as figuring out where the indentations exist, etc. A lot of syntax errors trying to create complex ones. I discovered a while ago, and this is not years ago, but just simply months ago when I was trying to do something, the switch. The switch says that what I have in a switch is a Boolean statement. In this case, the attended indicator. Again, if it's a that is what we'll be looking at. I mean, take this back. It is not a Boolean. It is an attribute. Correct it as I go through here. So switch says, give me an attribute. So here's my attribute, attended indicator. If it does not match one of the conditions within the switch, I want to give it a default value. So this first thing right after the attribute, field, or column is to give it the default value, which in this case is unknown. And then we can do as many of these as we want. If it's a 0, they did not attend. If it's a 1, they attended. You can make this be text, numeric, formulas, calculations, whatever you need to have done in here. One of the things to keep in mind is that this gets executed in order. And you'll see a little bit later in this presentation when I do this switch to clean up some data. So if it finds a 1, even if you're not simply a list of discrete values in case you want to do a couple of other processes or more complex things in here, it looks at them in order. It says that if it finds the first match, it stops looking. It doesn't look for something like the best match or the last match. It simply looks at the very first match and gives it that value and skips the rest of them. But again, we can go ahead and run this in the browse here. I've done a little bit job of reorganizing things. As you can see here, we now have the attended indicator, 1 or 0, the attended code, which is attended to not attend, which is through the IIF function. And then we also have the attended code 2, which is through the switch. So we have attended, not attend, everything matches up. We're happy with that one. Continuing onward, let's go ahead and look at what I did. If you notice, one of the things I do not like about the formula widget when you're using it is every time you run something and come back to the formula widget, it puts it back into its default state, which is essentially the first column being expanded out, being very small, and then you have to remember where you were and go onwards. So let's look at a way of finding out if it's the weekend or not. This is one that I found just a couple of weeks ago when I was doing something else entirely. I stumbled onto this by accident and I went, wow, I could have used this a long time ago. And I think if you watch some of my early videos, I've complained about not having an in function as far as within a filter. And so here it is. It was in there as an operator, the in, and I just had not found it. So I found it. This is really awesome that I can use it, but it says that if the day of week number is in, and I can give it a list. If it's 1 or a 7, it becomes true. If it is not a 1 or a 7, it becomes false. So again, you can include this in the Boolean of an if then else or an IIF, or I can just simply use it to return a true or a false. I can also put this in a filter, so it makes it very useful that way. So we can run this through very quickly, and you can see that we look at my output and we look at the day of week number. We can say that is a weekend flag is false. 1 and 7s are within my data. Keep in mind that is not Alteryx. Alteryx goes 0 through 6. It's something that we'll talk about, especially when we get to the string functions. Alteryx likes to begin counting things at 0. I went ahead and modified this to start counting at 1. Business people like 1s through 7s, not 0 through 6s. But it's your choice. Make sure everybody knows what you are doing. Adopt a standard for your organization. But anyway, so therefore, if all of these are false, here 7, which is a Saturday, and that is true. So it just sent that for me. Coming back to our functions, we have the is weekday flag. And it happens to work the same as the in, except we use a not in. So this becomes true if the value is not in the list, and the list is 1 and 7, and it is false if it is actually in there. So the not in is the opposite of the in. Makes it very easy for you to use, get your data out of it. And again, if we look at our solution example over here from our data, you can see that we have day of the week number, day of the week number, weekend flag is false, and then the is weekday flag is true. And they flip back and forth, so we know that worked quite well. So a little bit of tricks you can do with your using your Booleans, and especially if you're doing a if you're not doing a filter, you can do it in a formula that requires a Boolean, and that is simply the apostrophe or the bang. It is actually the not symbol. So another way we could determine if it was a weekday is if it is not the weekend. So here we created the weekend flag, and now we're using that in our calculation. And it's simply not is weekend will give us the value for weekday, which is true in our case. And it works the same as what we had done up here. So the reason that I'm showing you this is to understand the not for your Booleans, as well as the fact that you can use columns that you've created within your formula later in the formula. And it does it in order. It starts at the top and it works its way down. We won't run that just for saving a little bit of time. Let's look at the middle of the week val. This is an interesting function. It isn't as, I would like it to be more robust than it is, or return it a value slightly differently, but it is what it is. And while the bound works, which is again something that I had actually only found when I was doing this video, and I would like to have been using it years ago, it's sort of that range check that you have. Do you, when you're doing a SQL query and you do a value between, this sort of gives you the between, but not exactly what the between does, but you can get there. What the bound says is that I want to bound the day of the month number between 12 and 22. What that will do, and we'll look at the answer here very quickly, is that if the number is between 12 and 22, it gives you that value for an answer. If the value is less than 12, it gives you the value 12. If the value is greater than 22, it gives you the value 22. So essentially bounds the number to be within this range by squeezing the numbers outside of the range to the edges of the range. It is not quite what the between does. And again, if we look at this and look at the data over here on the right, this is day of month, and here's the middle of month value that we calculated. So the 1 returns our 12 because it's being squeezed into the bounding of that range. 17 stays 17, 7 goes to 12, 13 stays 13, etc. 24 comes down to 22. So this sort of gives me the testing as to whether it's in that range or not, but not quite. So I don't give them an A for their formula of their function, but I sort of give them a B minus for their function. I would like them to give me possibly another function that will return nulls if it is not within the bounded range, or just use bound by itself and go ahead and let me pass them a parameter to determine what to do with those that are outside of there, either returning the lower or upper value or returning me a null. But that being said, I wanted to fix that from a logic standpoint. So we come back into my next formula below there, and that is middle of the month value. Oh, day of month code. It's nice to remember where you were as you're moving up and down. So what we've done now is we've combined the switch with the bound, which is the middle of the month. So now it is actually returning us a set of values that were that range. And so what we want to do is take a look and switch on that middle of the month value. Remember, it's going to be returning us the 12 through the 22, with 12 being the lower bound, 22 being the upper bound, and everything else being in the middle. We must give it a default, so the default we're going to give it is unknown. If the middle of the month value equals the day of the first month, which means it was not changed by the bound, then we know we're in the middle of the month. If it's equal to 12, then it is dates that are at the first of the month. If it's the 22, it are days that are at the end of the month or the last part of the month. Now you might be questioning and thinking that what happens if I actually had a 12, because a 12 is by definition inside of that bound range. But since the switch processes top to bottom and doesn't consider it to be a best fit or worst fit, but rather the first match that it finds, if it was indeed a 12, then it would become positive, or this part would be true, when we compare it to the day of the month. So therefore it would not go to the next two tests. And of course, we can look at that and verify that that is indeed what happened. So we want the day of the month number, and we can see that 1, which returned us middle of the month value of 12, we can consider that the first of the month because it's not within the middle range. And if you look down a little ways, or a 12 or a 22, I know I had one in here, question where it came up at. Here's a 22. So here the 22, which is at the right end in the middle of the month, the value that the bound gave us was 22, it comes out and says that it is indeed the middle because that test ran first and it didn't use the third test in our formula. Which is here. Now to show you how sophisticated you can get, just in case you don't want this value floating around in your job stream, again, right afterwards I can always select it out, but you can combine those two things together, and basically if we make this big so you can see it, it gets to be a bit more complicated. So we're switching not on the value, but simply we're switching on the bound function. So we have the actual function call for bound in here that returned us the data that we wanted, and we can then do the rest of the switch based as we had done it before, which is this one here, which will return us the same values, but here it does it in 2 steps. This does it in 1 step. It's your choice. When I'm doing with complex formulas, I'd like to go ahead and do them in multiple steps and clean up the data when I'm done. And again, with looking at the data, you may have noticed we have 2 columns that return us the same value. So I know that my more complex function works the same as my 2 steps function, that goes from the day of the month number to middle of the month value and then translates the result. I can do all that in 1 step if I so choose. And I would recommend that if you do something like that, you put comments in there to make sure people can focus on what it is that you have done. Continuing on with functions, we want to go ahead and do some mathematical functions. I did not have some good math numbers inside of this data, so I created some good math numbers. All that I did here is I summarized my data by breed name, and I did an average for the day of week number by breed name for when they trained. This gives me a floating point number, which makes it good to do some mathematical formulas with. Before we move on to that, just remember something else I wanted to show you, and that is some things that are helpful to you. Let's go ahead and add a column called XXX. And you notice that over here there's some other options. So if we click on FX, it shows you the formulas. Here are some suggested formulas that you can do, and then you can find them. For example, here in Conditional, we have the if then else's, we have the if, and we have the switch. So clicking on one of those will insert that into your edit, and then you just need to edit it to be what you want it to be. You also have the ability down here to open saved and recently used expressions. It keeps a list on your machine of what different formulas you have created. And so then you can always just click on one of these either as a starting point or as the exact answer. If you really like one, you don't want to potentially lose it because this is just a top list of what's going on. Once you start doing this a bunch, things will start to roll off of here. You can also go ahead and you can save something. I really like that not is weekend flag, so I can save that, give it a name, not weekend by negative. Save that. If I really want to refer to sometime later, I can click the open. Down here in the saved expressions, we now have not weekend by negative. Click on that and we'll insert it in there as well. So it's some things that you can use. And if you're asking the question, how can I share some of these formulas with other people? I have looked. I don't know where it stores this information. If it is, it's stuffed inside of something that I cannot see. I have not spent a lot of time searching around to find it other than just a cursory. Maybe it's just obvious to me. It's somewhere that's not quite so obvious. If you need me to find it for you because you just can't live without sharing your calculations with other people and you don't want to do so through a workflow, go ahead and drop me a comment and I will do a little bit more digging because I'm sure if I dug deep enough, I would be able to find it. We can hit the delete button right there and that goes away. So let's talk about our math functions that we want to do. We just have a few we want to talk about. These are basic math functions that you are familiar with, except for one, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. So we have first the ceiling. Ceiling returns you the integer that is just above the floating point number. So if we look at our values here, you see that our averages are all between 4 and 5. And so if the average is 4.48, the ceiling is 5. That is the integer just above 4. We have the other side of that as a function, and it is floor. Floor returns you the value that's just below it as an integer. So the 4.1s and 2s and 20, 1s and 2s and 8s all will have a floor of 4, which is what we have in our solution set here as well. Not glorious data, but it happens to be the best we could do, but just gives you an idea what these functions are out there so you can easily see how they work. Again, these are some basic standard ones. Let's talk about round. Now, one of the things about Alteryx round is that it expects a value. A lot of time rounding only rounds it up to integers, but in this case you can tell it what to do, and it's sort of interesting how this round works. And in fact, I've never used round in my work, and so I had to play with this just a little bit to make sure it works. So if I want to give it a value, the value is to a degree looking at what you want to, how discrete you want to round it, for lack of a better thing, or you could actually round it in some strange ways. So if I round it and I give it the rounding, let's actually look here at round just to see. It gives a multiplier is what it calls. It's a very interesting thing to do. It does not make sense to me from what it called it, but it does make sense to me what it's going to do. So if I give it a value of 1, it will round it to the nearest multiple of 1, which means that it will be to the integer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. So that way when we round it with a 1, we get integers. If we want to keep one decimal place, we want to give it a multiplier of 0.1. What this says is it will round it to the tens. If we give it a value of 0.01, which is 2 decimal places, it will round it to the nearest hundredth. So it's an interesting way this round works. And a lot of the rounds that I've seen, you actually give them the number of digits that you were using. 0 meaning, which is what I sort of did here with its name. You would normally say 0, which rounds it to an integer, or 1, which rounds it to 1 decimal place, 2 rounds it to 2 decimal places. But in Alteryx world, you must give it this little multiplier, 1.1 and 0.01. You could also give something like a 4, and it will round us to the nearest multiple of 4, which would be 4, 8, 12, 16. I don't exactly know why you would do that, but if you need to, this function will do it for you. Looking at the output, you can see that is exactly what happened here. We took our numbers and rounded it to the integer of 4 or 5, depending upon where it comes. 1 decimal place and 2 decimal places. Alteryx also has this function called SmartRound, which says that it rounds it smartly depending upon what the data set is. I'm not exactly sure what that means, and I don't believe that from an analytic standpoint I'd ever want to allow the program to decide how to round my data. Because, for example, when we run the SmartRound, let me show you the formula very quickly. It's right down here with SmartRound. It's just simply a SmartRound function. You give it the value with no parameters. And again, you notice that the SmartRound is 4.5 for this number, but 4.35 for this number, 4.45 for 4.46, but 4.47 becomes simply 4.5. I'm not sure what it's trying to do there, but in case you wanted to try it, you're welcome to it. I don't have confidence that it would be doing what I wanted to do unless I knew exactly what I wanted it to do. I read the documentation and it didn't really tell me other than it rounded it depending upon the data set. Again, not sure what that means, but there it is for you to try to use if it makes sense for you to use it. Rounding out our functions, we sort of have these three random functions. I use random numbers a lot when I'm generating test data. I'm not sure from an analytics standpoint why you would be using random numbers, but you may have a need. But again, I do it all the time from random data creation. That's where all my puppy data came from. So when you give the RandInt, R-A-N-D-I-N-T, this gives you back an integer between 0 and what of any number you gave it. So if I give it a 5, it will return integers from 0 through 5. If I want a different spread of those numbers, I can just include it in a calculation. If I really wanted to say 1 through 6, I would do rand integer 5, and I would add 1 to it. It keeps it random, but moves the range up a little bit. The standard random function, RAND, which is in mathematical terms have been used for a long time, it returns your number between 0 and 1. If you think about that, that becomes everything after the decimal place. And then I can use this to my own facility and using it in a function as a calculation. So if I take my random float that I created here and I add 4 to it, I will get a number between 4 and 5, and it will not usually give me a 4 nor give me a 5, but something just slightly off of those. Take a look at that very quickly and you can see what we're talking about. So here is my random number, 0 through 5, random integer. Here's my random float between 0 and 1. I add 4 to it and I get a random number between 4 and 5. And I can go on from there. Some other things I can do if I want to have a range from 0 to 5, for example. Let me show you that very quickly as I modify this float 4. Let's just do it from 0 to 4. If I want a number from 0 to 4, I can go ahead and multiply that by 4. Let's run this one more time. And now you can see that my random float is between 0 and 4 and things in between. So that's a way you can actually get the type of random number if you want multiple decimal places out of it. Otherwise, use random integer, give it a range, and slide that range around. So I want to show you basically how you do math in someone says there's no mathematical functions inside of the formulas. How do I do a mathematical function? Well, you just simply do that. So what I've done here is taken the average day of the week value and took it away from the random float 4 just to see the difference between the random number and what the average is. And that simply is a mathematical operation that requires no extra functions. But I decided to include it there because I wanted to do the ABS. That's the absolute value. Because anything that's different than the average with a random number is that you'll have some above the average and some below the average. And if it's above the average, this calculation will become negative, but I just really wanted to see how far from the average it was on either side. I didn't really care about the positive or negatives, so I can get the absolute value, which returns all the negatives as positives, and it leaves all the positives alone. So again, flipping back over to my solution set, you can see that that is indeed what we have here, the delta average random. Interestingly enough, we don't have any negative numbers. How neat is that? Let's hear from random numbers coming out and not doing very many of them. So we can go ahead and run this again. And this brings me up another set of random numbers. Oh, I know why we changed this random float definition. That's why nothing came up negative. Let's add 4 to it, which is what it was. Let's run this one more time. Now we should be able to see the negative numbers. Here we go. So we have a positive 0.1 and a negative 0.5, and both of them from an absolute value turns out to be a 0.1 positive and a 0.5 positive. You will notice that there's been some warnings here which I've completely ignored during the course of this video. If there's something that it doesn't like about the data or something that it did to the data as far as display purposes are concerned, it goes ahead and gives you a little bit of a warning by having this red triangle in the upper right hand corner, and if you hover over it, it tells you it was rounded to 6 decimal places for clarity. The actual data has many more decimal places than that in it. So that's a good little idea to watch out for as you're going through and looking at your data. As you can see, the same thing occurred up here at the beginning from the calculations. So that's one would have hoped a brief walk through a bunch of functions, and the ones that I use quite often, as well as ones that you may not use or known about, and that's one of the things that I learned along the way. So in part 2 and then part 3, we're going to look at string functions. There's a lot of string functions out there. Those will help us. And then after that, we'll be looking at the date and time functions, which a lot of people use, and you'll find out that it can really make your analytics much more simple by knowing what those functions can do. So again, go ahead and if you like this video, click on the like button, subscribe so I know you're out there watching. And if you have any questions or some additional videos you would like to see, please drop me a comment. Have a great day.